Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Dami Adewale.
And I'm Lucinda Rouse. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. This week we'll be getting the insider's perspective on the Royal Academy of Music's biggest and most ambitious fundraising campaign in its 200-year history. But first, our senior news reporter Emily Hall recently spoke to the chief executive of Alzheimer's Research UK. You can find the full write-up of that interview with Hilary Evans-Newton on the Third Sector website, but we're going to share some snippets from that interview now.
Hilary Evans-Newton has been the chief executive of Alzheimer's Research UK for almost 10 years. Under her leadership, the charity has experienced huge growth, with income of about 10 million when she joined, rising to almost 60 million in the last financial year. Hilary said the charity sees itself as something of a wave maker in the sector, and in this clip she'll explain why.
We still don't reach enough people who are affected by dementia by any means. But actually, for the first time, there was an organisation out there saying, this isn't a normal part of ageing. This is caused by a disease. Diseases can be understood with medical research. They can be treated, they can be cured. And we were telling that story in a way that people hadn't told it before. So we were the first organisation that talked about this being a cause of death, that we talked about the devastation that this disease causes, and the reality of it. And I think that then really resonated. And so obviously we've seen growth and, we're not far off 60 million now as income for the organisation, which is fantastic. And, a huge shift obviously from where we are, but not where I'd like to be. And I've got plans in the next 10 years of where I'd like the organisation to be. But in order to do that, you do need that focus. You need a team to come together. You need those partnerships. This isn't just about us working on our own. And we need to see the science delivering.
Just picking up on what Hilary was saying there about the need to tell the story of dementia in a new way. That hasn't come without some controversy. You might recall Alzheimer's Research UK's Change the Ending advert, which came out last September. It was narrated by Olivia Colman and changes the ending of a cartoon fairy tale in which a princess is saved from a dragon by her Prince Charming. But instead of living happily ever after, the prince is struck down by the invisible force of dementia. And the video certainly doesn't hold back in depicting the brutal reality of living with the disease. The advert did receive some very harsh criticism, including from fellow dementia charity Alzheimer Scotland, for perpetuating dated stereotypes and failing to depict moments of light and love. Here's what Hilary Evans-Newton had to say about that.
Showing the reality of this condition is really important. There are therefore, some challenges in doing that with a 30, 40-second film. And so I think that what we needed to do was to convey the urgency, the reality of the condition, and think about something that was bold, that could be effective, that had that sort of cut through. I wouldn't ever want anything that we do to upset people or upset people with dementia, and I fully take on that feedback. We need to be impactful, but we don't want to be sensationalist. I don't think this was sensationalist, and we need to ensure that we are working with our community and we are giving them a voice and a platform. And so, a number of our different films will maybe have a slightly different look and feel and appeal to different people, but I don't shy away from telling difficult stories and showing the reality of this condition. And that is upsetting. But we know that actually in order to get people focused and thinking and talking about that, sometimes that is the approach that you need to take.
Another area that Hilary touched on was the challenge of being a chief executive and a parent to young children. She told us about the responsibility she feels of being something of a role model in this area.
There are a lot more women in chief exec roles in the sector now than there were 10 years ago. Which is brilliant, and a lot younger women. So, I think one of the conversations I had quite early on, I think I might have been pregnant with my first, was from a female chief executive in the sector who was saying, gosh, I just couldn't have done it when my children were little. I don't know how on earth you manage. And I sort of see where they're coming from, but actually at that point it's really not very helpful. Because what I want to hear is from people who, can do it all, say, actually it's inspiring and, actually we're all here as a kind of sector to support you. And so I hope that that's what I'm able to do kind of within my organisation and more widely as well.
And finally, Hilary shared her views on the new government's performance so far. And it's worth noting that she started her career in the political space as a parliamentary researcher.
We're still in the early days of this government, and I think that that's really clear and that's playing through. We are also, I'd say, working with a government who were very ready for an election and maybe not quite so ready for governing. And so from a health charity perspective, I think there's a lot that we will be working with ministers on when it comes to NHS review, a 10-year plan. There's a lot of consultation happening. This is a good start, but I think that we are here and make use of this sector and the expertise and our people and our understanding of the implications of major shifts in policy will have on people's lives and our communities.
You can read the full write-up of the interview with Hilary Evans-Newton under the Features tab on the Third Sector website, and we'll include a link to the article in the show notes to this episode.
Moving on to our main discussion, we are continuing our fundraising theme following last week's conversation about Leeds Hospital's charity's £6.8 million appeal to build a new motor neuron disease centre. It was the charity's biggest ever appeal and drew more than 17,000 supporters, each giving an average of £35. It was a highly ambitious appeal for a charity of its size, which has previously relied mainly on passive income from grateful patients. This week, we're going to explore an appeal at the other end of the spectrum. 2 years ago, the Royal Academy of Music launched a £60 million campaign called the Royal Academy of Music's Future to invest in facilities, teachers and scholarships for promising young musicians. And in October of this year, having comfortably exceeded that £60 million target, they extended the campaign value to £100 million.
We're delighted to be joined in the studio by Kirsty MacDonald, the Academy's Deputy Principal for Advancement, whose responsibilities include fundraising. Kirsty, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Could you tell us, why was this ambitious campaign considered necessary?
Well, I guess like any good fundraising campaign, it was completely motivated by the needs of the Academy, which have really grown over its 200-year history. So we were very struck by the fact that students, in order to afford to come to the Academy, needed more and more help. So scholarships and bursaries and trying to make sure that the widest possible range of students can afford to come to the Academy, regardless of their financial position. We also recognize that any new initiative, buildings, refurbishments, we have a grade 2 listed building. We were constantly needing to improve and develop our facilities. Those sorts of things needed fundraising as well. And really the cost of delivering our education is so high per student that we have to raise money just to be able to deliver the highest quality student experience. So there were a lot of needs, and that's why we decided that a campaign, a comprehensive campaign as we would call it, would be really helpful.
And where had you previously been getting most of your money from? Was this a big change in your fundraising approach?
Well, there's been a fundraising department at the Academy for some time. I mean, it must be at least probably 20 years. So it was fairly well established, raising money primarily for scholarships and bursaries. And it had started a campaign to build a new theatre, the Susie Sainsbury Theatre and the Angela Burgess Recital Hall. But it didn't really have the infrastructure, and I can talk a little bit about that. So for the Academy, it was raising money. It wasn't raising very large amounts. It was raising about $1.5 million a year. And we've grown that to anywhere between about 12 and 18 million a year now. So we've grown it significantly.
Wow. So yes, up to 100 million for this campaign. And so it's already been 2 years. When are you hoping to reach your target by?
Well, we expect to be able to reach it in the next 2 years or so. We haven't publicly mentioned a date because, as we all know from the last few years, anything can happen. But assuming it all goes well, we'll expect to reach that target in a couple of years.
I wanted to talk about your most lucrative income channels then. Could you tell me what those are and if they've changed recently?
So one of the things that we've done to really increase the income significantly from philanthropy has been major donors and talking to people about making pretty significant gifts across a range of different purposes. Endowment has been a very large one. So that will be something that's quite unusual for a lot of charities, but we've had quite a big focus on endowment. A lot of that work is done through building relationships with private individuals. And that has been mainly people who love music rather than what you might expect from a university, which is that they go to their alumni. And yes, some of them, like the wonderful Elton John, are very generous. But most of the people who give are just people who love music. So building up those relationships through relationship management, really getting to know them, getting to understand their interests, and then matching those with the priorities of the Academy has really been the main thrust of our success in recent years.
And how have you found it best to develop those relationships with your supporters? Presumably they are not short-term partnerships.
No, you're absolutely right, Lucinda. These are very long-term relationships. Many of them have already been involved for a number of years, and we hope they'll be committed supporters for a very long time. And that's the wonderful thing about raising money from people, from individuals who make their own decisions. And I think if you can really get to know them and bring them into the family of the organization, they become very long-term donors indeed. I think it's not a huge scale operation. I mean, there will be universities dealing with thousands and thousands of donors, and then you just need more and more staff to do that. We're still a relatively small team of about 18 people in the philanthropy team. And a number of those staff, including myself, have a portfolio of people that we're responsible for. And we think very carefully about how those people are matched with the right fundraiser who really get to know them and engage them in the life of the Academy. And in doing so, understand what they're interested in supporting and hopefully encourage them to make significant gifts, sometimes over a number of years, which is incredibly important for our future planning.
And so what's changed in recent years in terms of your approach to speaking to supporters, past, present, and hopefully future? Is it just a case that you're turbocharging your activities to reach this very ambitious target, or are there any really new innovations that you brought in?
Well, I think it is a number of things. I think we definitely have turbocharged it. We also decided early on when I arrived about 8 years ago that we needed to build more infrastructure around fundraising. You know, there is a science as well as an art to fundraising, and we recognized that we needed to make sure we had all the right data and systems and due diligence, which is more and more important, of course, these days. Research, we have an excellent research team. So all of these things were being built. And as we said at the time, we were sort of building the bicycle while we were riding it, where we were trying to build all this infrastructure at the same time as trying to raise the money for the previous campaign, which was for the theater and the recital hall. So what's changed for us has been scaling up of that, hiring more people. When I started, we only had about 5 people in the team, and it's now 18. And we really started to build all the things that you need around fundraising, the right events and stewardship, as I say, the right systems, making sure that we were using the time that our staff had, to the best possible effect. And I think all of, a lot of the same activities were happening before. We've just scaled them up, and we've put much more focus on understanding the big, ambitious things that the Academy wants to do. I think one of the reasons we've been successful is simply because we have been more ambitious, and we've asked people to make bigger commitments over longer periods of time. And it is amazing that, as the old saying goes, if people are asked, they give. And our experience is exactly that.
And would you mind telling me what level of donations we're looking at? Last week we heard from Leeds Hospital's charity, they received £35 per donor. How does that compare to your campaign?
Well, we do all ranges of fundraising appeals. So yes, some of our appeals are getting relatively small donations, under £100 per person, when we're asking people to just make a donation, perhaps people who are buying tickets and coming to our events, and they might make a small donation or regular donation, right up to people that we're asking for several £1 million to endow in perpetuity let's say, a chair of one of our teaching departments. And the first one that we had endowed was the Gatsby Chair in Musical Theater. So this really enables that post to exist in perpetuity. So it's a big range of gifts. And I guess like anything, we have in the back of our minds, a pyramid of gifts, lots of small gifts, and heading up towards a relatively small number of very big gifts.
And presumably that also requires different types of supporter management, supporter engagement.
Exactly. So those smaller regular donors, we really aim to keep them informed about the Academy. We may well meet them when they come to events, but we're not necessarily engaging them in a one-to-one relationship with members of the team. We have a lot of people leaving us legacy commitments, legacy pledgers. So those are quite sort of one-to-one relationships with our excellent legacy manager. And then the bigger gifts, of course, are much more those one-to-one relationships. And also importantly, not just with the fundraising team, but also with other people around the organization. This is a team sport. Fundraising at that level isn't just about a fundraising manager. It's about everybody through the organization, from the wonderful staff we have on the front desk when you just walk into the Academy. And I hope you'll come and visit and see what I mean. But you immediately get this great sense of warmth and friendliness from the staff at our front desk, right through to the principal, who is incredibly charismatic, interested in people, loves to talk to donors, is the Academy, and is an amazing advocate for philanthropy.
Just briefly before, you mentioned about the challenges of kind of riding the bicycle at the same time as building it. So could you just talk a bit more about that and anything else that's proved particularly challenging or has required a rethink from yourselves?
Well, I've got to say, when I arrived in 2016, everything was challenging. Everything I looked at, I thought, oh goodness, we're going to have to look at that again. Or just sometimes it's basic business processes, which you think, well, we're taking 10 steps to do something that really should take 2 steps. So sometimes it was simple things. And that's where working with our finance department is really important, and something I would always advise. Fundraisers need to be numerate and, happy to work with their colleagues in finance so that the basic processes are working, the money is coming in. I know it sounds really silly in a way, but it seems so obvious, but getting those things right was really important. I think we had a lot of challenges just internally helping gain the trust and understanding of colleagues who wondered, why are we hiring all these fundraisers? Isn't that costing a lot of money? Shouldn't we just be hiring more teachers and having more students? And again, that's kind of come from the top, from the principal, Jonathan Freeman Atwood, who has been incredibly good at helping to make the case. And we all spend quite a lot of our time making that case. So I think there's been a real shift, a demonstrable shift in what I would now call a culture of philanthropy at the Academy. So that has really changed over the last few years.
And could you give a specific example of a tweak or a change that has needed to have been made internally that may have been very simple, as you mentioned in your work with the finance department, for example, that has made a really big difference?
Well, we've done a number of things with finance I think have made a big difference. I mean, one of the things that comes to mind, as a 200-year-old institution, we have an awful lot of funds that we have for historic reasons that we needed to basically synchronize better so we could use the money. Sometimes we get slightly odd, legacies from 50 years ago or 60 years ago, which are not really relevant anymore. So we did a big exercise, which we had to actually go to the Charity Commission to get approval for, which was to streamline a lot of these funds and move them into more general funds so that the money could be used. That was a big and detailed project that had to be done in partnership between finance and philanthropy and even other people around the organization, people who had access to archives where we needed to understand, or we need to try and reach families, the descendants of people who made some of those gifts. So that was a very big exercise. But I can also give you a very simple exercise that we did. We had a consultant company called Alveo come in and do some initial work when I started. And they made one very simple recommendation, which is they said, you should have a separate bank account for all the fundraising income. And we hadn't had that before. And it seems really simple, but it just meant that our team was able to very easily reconcile monthly figures. And it just seems like such an obvious thing. But when you're in an organization which has a £30 million turnover, and at that time, a relatively small amount of money was coming through fundraising. Obviously, it's grown a lot. It just made life a little bit easier. It was one of those things that I said, if you can just get some of the infrastructure and the business processes streamlined, it makes a big difference.
That's really interesting. And you are in an interesting position as a Academy of Music, in that you're straddling the university's space and the arts and music space. You must have a good idea of what your peer organisations are doing. How does your campaign compare to other universities, for example, or other arts organisations? What's unique about it?
Well, I have a couple of voluntary roles which help me to understand what's going on around the sector. One is the chair of the CASE Europe Trust, which is our umbrella organization in the higher education sector. It's the Council for the Advancement and Support of Education, CASE. So that organization does an incredibly valuable annual survey. So any university that participates not only gets the access to other data, but also has a really good understanding then of where they sit within the sector. So we have a very clear idea, and that is that we're within about the top 20 universities in the UK for fundraising. And that leads to my other voluntary role, which is to be the current chair of the Rouse group, which is a collective of the top fundraising universities in the UK. So that includes the heady heights of Oxford and Cambridge, of course, doing unbelievably good work in this area, and many of the Russell Group universities and some of the specialist universities. So we know that we are raising significantly more than most of the specialists, not all of them, but most of the specialist institutions, and more than the rest of the conservatoire sector. And that's for a whole variety of reasons, some of which I've mentioned, but also we've had incredible support from a number of volunteers. But there's a lot of ingredients, I think, that go into that success.
And you spoke previously about your knowledge of the arts and culture sector. So I just wanted to go back to that and kind of ask if you had any tips or for other charities embarking on a similarly ambitious campaign. What would you say to them?
Well, I think any fundraising campaign needs to be very rooted in the real needs of the organization. And it's about being able to tell the story of what the organization aspires to do. I think it's also got to be based in being able to demonstrate the difference, the impact that a donation will make. I think there are so many things that people can give to, and I always encourage donors to give to anything and everything they want to give to. So it's going to come down to where they think their gift is going to make a difference and where they believe that the organization is going to be able to deliver what they say they're going to deliver. So I think a lot of it is rooted in having an exciting, compelling story to tell, whatever organization you are, and making sure that the fundraising campaign is very firmly rooted in real needs. We like to be very transparent about the costs of things. People, we're talking about individuals, philanthropists who are very savvy, who are, they expect us to be very clear and very transparent about what it costs to deliver our kind of education and therefore the impact of their giving. So I think that's the most important thing. I think it's also important to have very clear priorities and to make sure that you are marrying up those priorities with the interests of your donors. You don't want to be just driven by a donor saying, I'd like you to do this, and then you sort of scratch your head and say, I guess we could. You've got to know what the organization really needs the money for, and then the best relationships are when the donor's giving something that means something to them, and it also is going to make a difference, and the organization wants money for that purpose. So I think those are important elements. I think I would also say that investment in fundraising is so vital, that anybody who wants to raise their ambitions has to get more investment and make sure that the money that is being invested sensibly in the right areas. We've from time to time had consultants help us take a look at things, help us adjust. And that's also been a very valuable investment for us. So the most important thing I would say is about the people, whether it's the head of the institution really engaging in fundraising. If they don't, and I think it's probably in the charity sector, you probably couldn't run a charity without being totally invested in fundraising. That's not always the case in higher education and the arts, and it needs to be. The people at the top of the organization, the trustees, have to be really invested in this and committed. And then you need fantastic fundraisers and people in the team. And we have that. We have an amazing team of dedicated people who work incredibly hard to help the Academy.
So much of what you've said there in those tips will be relevant to charities across the board. So thank you very much for that. I just wondered, on a final parting note, you must have colleagues working for other charitable organisations and hopefully be able to draw inspiration from what other charities are doing. Are there any fundraising campaigns that you've seen in the recent past that you have really drawn inspiration from and you really say, gosh, that's a brilliant idea?
Gosh, there's lots of different examples I can think of. I really do love a lot of the advertising that Macmillan does. And I know you've interviewed Gemma Peters, who's an incredible leader. And I find the story that Macmillan has to say is really powerful. I remember also a few years ago, the Ovarian Cancer Trust did an incredible I Will Survive video. I don't know if you remember this. And I immediately made a donation. I was just so moved. It was young girls mimicking the song. And it was incredibly powerful. I love what charities do with these sort of big TV campaigns. Obviously not relevant for us, but I think it does go back to what I said earlier, which is about telling a really compelling story and showing people what difference their gift will make. So I love those things. I always love seeing what universities are doing in their campaigns and always watch carefully, having worked at both Oxford and Cambridge in the past, what they do in terms of really bold and ambitious appeals and thinking in a very, very big scale. I find that really inspiring.
And going back to Macmillan, for anybody who's not aware of what they do, could you tell us a bit about what it is that makes you so inspired by their campaign?
Well, I just think that they really make people think about the importance of the support that you get when you're dealing with cancer and how the Macmillan nurses go above and beyond to help people. And I know that Gemma's had to do a lot of change management in the organization because she's so motivated to get the right resource in the right place. And I think that's the big challenge with these very large charities. And I think making sure that they can deliver, especially when we know the government doesn't have enough funds. And I know there'll be lots of change coming up with the NHS, both in terms of how it's funded and how it functions. But the role of these charities is so vital to individuals. And it comes back to the individual and how they will personally benefit from the service that Macmillan provides. And I just think they're really good at communicating that story in all of their material.
Kirsty, it's been so great to have you with us. Thank you very much for joining us and all the best for the remaining part of the campaign.
Thank you very much. It's been great to be here with both of you.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Kirsty, and that's it for this week. We'll be joined next time by Michelle Mitchell to find out how Cancer Research UK is future-proofing itself and ensuring it remains fit for purpose in the current challenging context. From Dami and from me, thank you for listening. Our producer is Nav Pal.